One wrong train ride led a lonely CEO to the one thing money couldn't buy: love. Before we begin the story, leave a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. And subscribe to our channel so you don't miss our latest stories. Enjoy the story. People always say success has a price, but no one ever talks about how much it costs to feel absolutely nothing. Ethan Cole had everything he was told to want: the penthouse overlooking Central Park, the company with $1 billion valuation, a face that graced the covers of business magazines, and a calendar so packed there wasn't room to breathe. He was 39, the head of one of the fastest growing tech empires in the world, and not a single part of him could remember the last time he felt alive. It wasn't supposed to be like this. He told himself that often. Late at night, when the city buzzed beneath his window, and the silence inside his apartment felt louder than anything he'd ever built. He had climbed every ladder, broken every ceiling. He had arrived. But somewhere, between his first million and the private jet, something inside him had gone completely still. That morning, it was raining in New York. He had an 8 a.m. train to Boston, another high-stakes meeting, another round of negotiations that could alter the trajectory of a company. His assistant had texted him the details. His driver had dropped him at the station with a coffee in hand. Everything, as usual, was managed, except he wasn't. Ethan stepped onto the wrong platform. Whether it was the distraction of a news alert on his phone, the buzz of an anxious investor calling again, or simply the weight of his own exhaustion, he boarded the wrong train. He didn't realize it until an hour had passed and his signal disappeared. Not weak. Gone. He looked up, expecting glass and steel, and found trees. Endless, damp, green trees. As if the city had been peeled away like old wallpaper. He cursed under his breath and checked the digital display above the door. The destination didn't read Boston. It read something else, something unfamiliar. Woodstock, he muttered, baffled. It sounded like a mistake, like a joke. But no one was laughing, and no one on the train even seemed to notice they were slipping away from the world. He wanted to stand up, demand answers, turn the damn train around. But the car was mostly empty, and the few passengers who remained sat with unread books and quiet stares out the window, as if they had all agreed to escape something too. A man in a blazer sleeping with his head against the glass. A teenager scribbling in a notebook. An elderly woman knitting. No one panicked. No one seemed lost but him. The conductor passed by, humming a soft tune Ethan didn't recognize. "I'm on the wrong train," Ethan said sharply. "Maybe you're exactly where you need to be," the man replied with a shrug, never breaking stride. The words landed harder than they should have. Ethan turned to the window and watched as the gray haze of the city dissolved behind him, replaced by an open sky, crumbling barns, dirt roads, and the kind of silence that demanded you sit with your own thoughts. That was the most terrifying part. By the time the train reached Woodstock, the sun had climbed through the clouds. The air was crisp, startlingly fresh, and uncomfortably still. There were no cars honking, no phone vibrations, no emails screaming for his attention. Just the thud of his own heartbeat and the unfamiliar sound of his breath. He stepped off the train with nothing but his briefcase and a growing unease curling inside his chest. The platform was empty, the town quiet like it hadn't yet decided to wake up. Storefronts lined the street, each painted in soft pastels with wooden signs that creaked gently in the wind. A bakery, a bookstore, a coffee shop with 2 chairs out front and no one in line. It was the kind of place that felt like it existed outside of time, and he hated how much it moved him. There were no Ubers, no luxury hotels, no reception. The next train wouldn't arrive until morning. He was stuck, completely, absurdly stuck. But as he stood there, adjusting his jacket, trying to remind himself that he was Ethan Cole, the man who fixed problems, who made empires from algorithms, a question he hadn't asked in years crept into his mind like smoke. What if you weren't meant to go back? The thought was ridiculous, but it stayed. It clung. And in the silence that followed, Ethan realized the strangest thing of all. He wasn't in a rush anymore, not because he didn't need to be, but because, for the first time in a decade, he didn't want to be. And just beyond the edge of the platform, standing near a row of flower pots beneath a cafe awning, a woman watched him with quiet curiosity. She didn't recognize him. She didn't fawn or flinch or reach for a phone. She simply smiled. And in that single, unexpected moment, something in Ethan Cole shifted. It would take him weeks to understand why, but it began there, on a forgotten platform, in a forgotten town, because of a forgotten train. And nothing, absolutely nothing, would ever be the same again. The train had vanished behind him like a closing chapter, leaving only the faint scent of metal and earth in its wake. Ethan Cole stood motionless on the quiet platform, the weight of the wrong destination pressing heavily on his shoulders. He could still hear the echo of his own thoughts clanging louder than the train's last screech. There was no one to blame, no executive assistant to fire, no technology glitch to fix, just a moment of unintended pause in a life that had never allowed for one. Woodstock was not what he expected. The town, cocooned in the folds of Vermont's green hills, looked like it had been lifted straight from a memory no longer his. There were no LED billboards flashing stock tickers, no luxury cars humming by. Just a stillness that felt both unnerving and oddly intimate. He adjusted the cuffs of his tailored coat, more out of habit than necessity, and began walking. The streets were cobbled, uneven, as if time hadn't dared smooth them out. A young couple strolled hand in hand. An older man sipped coffee on a wooden bench, and the woman from the platform, the one who had watched him with quiet curiosity, was nowhere in sight. Still, her face lingered in his mind longer than he cared to admit. The first sign that this town ran on a rhythm unfamiliar to him came when he tried to check train schedules from his phone. No signal. Of course. He tried the cafe, hoping for Wi-Fi, but the chalkboard sign out front read, "Unplug, unwind, reconnect with real people." It might as well have been mocking him. Every fiber of his being wanted to resist the quiet. He thrived in motion, in decision-making, in having control. But here, motion was replaced by meandering, decisions by gentle conversation, and control by surrender. He found himself wandering down the main street, passing a line of mom-and-pop stores with names like Maple and Hearth, The Painted Sparrow, and Goodleaf Books. Each window offered a glimpse into lives that seemed rooted in something deeper than productivity. He passed a small bakery that filled the air with warm cinnamon and sugar. A hand-lettered sign in the window read, "Fresh out of the oven. Try something sweet. Life's short." The words hit him harder than expected. He hadn't eaten since morning. No assistant had reminded him to. No meeting had left time. He walked in, drawn not just by the smell, but by the strange ache in his chest that he couldn't quite name. The inside was warmly lit, filled with quiet chatter and the soft hum of an old song playing from a corner speaker. Behind the counter stood a young woman with flour-dusted hands, chatting with a man about blueberry scones. Ethan ordered a coffee and sat by the window. Outside, life moved at half the speed he was used to. And yet, it didn't feel slow. It felt intentional. He watched a child chase bubbles down the sidewalk. A dog dozed in the sun. A woman stepped out of a florist shop, carrying tulips wrapped in brown paper. There was an ease here, an unspoken trust that the world wouldn't fall apart if you took a moment to breathe. His coffee arrived. No app notification, no buzzing pager. Just a smile from the barista and a quiet enjoy. He stirred the cup slowly, unsure what to do with all the empty space between one breath and the next. Then he saw her again, the woman from the platform. She was standing outside the bookshop across the street, her hand resting lightly on the doorframe, her gaze fixed on something inside. The afternoon sun caught the auburn tones in her hair, and her dress, though simple, moved like part of the breeze. There was something grounded about her, not in the way of someone who was stuck, but someone who had chosen to stay. Ethan couldn't explain why he crossed the street. He only knew he had to. As he stepped into the bookstore, a bell chimed gently overhead. The scent of old pages and cedar filled the air, and the quiet was not the sterile hush of a corporate lobby. It was a comforting kind of silence, the kind that held space for thought. She turned to look at him, not surprised, not overly warm, just present. "You found your way," she said, a hint of amusement in her voice. "I'm still not sure where I'm going," Ethan replied, and it was the most honest thing he'd said in days. She introduced herself as Mira, just Mira. No titles, no explanations. In that moment, he envied her clarity. They spoke casually at first, about books, the weather, the bakery next door. But beneath each exchange, something intangible stirred. She didn't ask him what he did. She didn't try to figure out why he looked like someone who didn't belong. She simply talked to him like he was human. For a man whose life had been reduced to boardroom personas and polished LinkedIn bios, it was disarming and quietly profound. As they stood surrounded by shelves filled with stories written by strangers, Ethan had the distinct feeling he was stepping into one of his own. One not yet written. One that didn't come with a business plan, an exit strategy, or a 5-year forecast. And though he wouldn't admit it, not yet, he was starting to wonder if the wrong train had delivered him to the only place that could ever feel right. The bell above the door gave a soft chime as Ethan stepped deeper into the bookstore, its sound fading into the quiet hum of the old building. The floor creaked beneath his polished shoes, shoes that felt too formal, too rigid for this place. The space around him was filled with rows of well-worn shelves, some leaning slightly, as though tired from holding decades of stories. Sunlight filtered in through tall windows, scattering warm patches of gold across the wooden floor. The scent of old paper and lavender lingered in the air, like something familiar yet long forgotten. Mira moved behind the small wooden counter, casually stacking a few books while speaking to an older woman who laughed softly before exiting the shop with a smile and a wave. There was a rhythm to everything here, a gentle pace that seemed perfectly in tune with the town itself. Ethan stood for a moment, unsure of what to do with his hands, unsure of what to do with himself. Mira gestured toward the shelves. Feel free to wander. The shelves are a little chaotic, but that's part of the charm. He nodded and drifted between the aisles, his fingers brushing the spines of novels he hadn't read, histories he never had time for, poetry he used to love before spreadsheets and pitch decks crowded out the quiet parts of his life. He picked up a weathered volume of Robert Frost's collected poems and flipped it open. The page it landed on read, "Two roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by." He let out a soft, unamused exhale through his nose. The irony wasn't lost on him. "This town always surprises people," Mira said from a few steps behind him, her voice low and conversational. "They think they're just passing through, but something about it makes people stay longer than they planned." "I won't be here long," Ethan said quickly, more to himself than to her. "Just a mistake. I got on the wrong train." She tilted her head slightly, studying him, not with judgment, but with a quiet kind of curiosity. "You say that like it's a bad thing." "I had meetings. I have a company to run," he replied, instinctively defensive. "And now you have a day off," she said, smiling gently. "That doesn't sound so terrible." Ethan didn't answer. He couldn't. Not because he didn't have words, but because she wasn't wrong. And it unsettled him more than he cared to admit. Mira walked toward a reading nook by the window and sat down, curling her legs beneath her as she reached for a book from the nearby table. Ethan hesitated, then followed, sitting across from her in a matching armchair that groaned slightly under his weight. "So," she said, without looking up, "what do you do when you're not getting lost on trains?" He looked at her then, really looked, and realized she hadn't asked with any ulterior motive. There was no flicker of recognition in her eyes, no subtle shift that hinted she was impressed or intimidated. She simply wanted to know. For the first time in years, he felt like his answer didn't have to be rehearsed. "I build things," he said carefully. "Like furniture?" He smiled despite himself. "No, tech. I run a company that designs AI platforms for businesses." Mira nodded thoughtfully. "That sounds complicated." "It is, and exhausting." There was a silence between them, but not an awkward one. It was the kind that allowed thoughts to stretch out and settle. Outside, a breeze stirred the leaves on the trees. A child's laugh echoed faintly from down the street. Ethan leaned back and watched Mira as she read, her expression calm, present, like she wasn't thinking about anything else in the world. "I envy that," he said softly. She looked up. "What? You seem still, like you're actually here. I can't remember the last time I felt that." Mira closed the book, gently, and met his gaze. "You don't have to run everything. You know, life doesn't always need a strategy. Sometimes it just needs attention." The words struck him with a quiet intensity. He had built an empire on strategy. Every hour of his life was accounted for, optimized, monetized. But here, in this sleepy little bookstore in a town that time had seemingly forgotten, someone was telling him that being present was enough. And it sounded like truth. "You live here?" he asked, shifting the conversation to safer ground. "I do. Grew up not far from here, left for a while, came back." "Why?" "I think the better question is, why not?" she said. "I like the rhythm of this place. There's space for people here, space to breathe." That word again, breathe. How long had it been since he'd done that, without checking his watch? He stood up, restless. "I should find somewhere to stay. There's no train out until morning. There's a small inn just a few blocks down. Ask for Maggie. Tell her Mira sent you." He thanked her and turned to leave, pausing at the door. "Hey," she called after him, her voice softer now. "Even if it was the wrong train, you're not the first person to end up here without a plan, and no one here will ask you to be anything but yourself." Ethan nodded, unsure of what to say. But something about her words clung to him, stayed with him as he walked through the town in search of a place to sleep. For once, the road ahead wasn't mapped. There were no clear directions. And to his surprise, that thought didn't terrify him. Not completely. The inn stood on the corner of Maple and River, a 3-story Victorian house with ivy curling around its white pillars and wide, welcoming windows that glowed with amber light. It didn't look like much at first glance. No marble lobby, no concierge, no valet. But as Ethan stepped inside, the warmth was immediate, not just in temperature, but in tone. The air smelled faintly of cedarwood and something sweet, maybe vanilla. A cat stretched lazily on a velvet armchair near the fireplace, and a soft jazz melody drifted from a vintage radio. The woman behind the desk looked up from a crossword puzzle. "Let me guess," she said, before Ethan could speak. "You're not from around here." "I suppose that obvious," he replied, forcing a polite smile. "You're wearing a watch that probably costs more than my car," she said, not unkindly. "And you look like you haven't slept in years." He chuckled, surprising himself. Mira said to ask for Maggie. Her eyes softened at the name. "Ah, then you're one of the lucky ones. Room 3's open. 2nd floor, end of the hall. You'll hear the creak through the window if you leave it cracked. Most guests say it helps them sleep. Sleep." That word again, like a foreign language he barely remembered how to speak. He thanked her and made his way upstairs, each step on the old wooden staircase creaking beneath his weight. The room was modest but inviting. A quilted bed, a small writing desk by the window, and a reading chair, positioned perfectly to catch the afternoon light. For once, there was no tablet waiting, no itinerary, no urgent file to review. He sat on the edge of the bed and exhaled slowly. The silence wasn't hollow. It was full of unseen lives, stories, and time itself. His body, unburdened from schedules and signals, began to relax in ways he hadn't permitted it to in years. He had just started to drift into thought when a soft knock tapped at the door. When he opened it, Mira stood there, holding 2 paper cups and a small brown bag. "I figured you hadn't eaten," she said. "And I also figured you wouldn't ask." He stepped aside and gestured her in. "You figured right." They sat on the edge of the bed, sipping spiced apple cider and sharing a still warm muffin split down the middle. There was no pretense between them, no attempt to fill every silence. Mira had a way of being still without being stagnant, present without pressing. She didn't ask about his work again, and he didn't volunteer it. Instead, she told him about the bookstore, how it had belonged to her mother, who used to tuck handwritten notes into random books for readers to find. How after years living in Boston and chasing a career that never quite fit, she came back one summer and never left. Some places, she said, remind you of who you are without asking you to prove anything. Ethan nodded, feeling the weight of that truth settle in his chest. The city had never stopped asking him to prove himself. Not once. "What did you think you'd be doing by now?" she asked after a while. "I thought I'd be happy," he said before he could stop himself. Mira didn't flinch. She simply let the words land, let them exist. And are you? She asked gently. I don't know, he answered truthfully. I don't think I've even stopped long enough to ask. They sat in silence again, sipping from their cups, the light outside dimming into a soft twilight. Through the window, the sound of the creek murmured like a lullaby, constant and comforting. The kind of sound that didn't ask for attention, but offered companionship. When she stood to leave, she paused at the doorway and looked back at him. You don't have to know all the answers tonight, Ethan. Maybe it's enough that you're asking different questions. After she left, he sat in the quiet for a long time. The town was beginning to settle into its evening hush, and through the cracked window, he could hear laughter rising from somewhere down the street. It wasn't the forced, polished laughter of a networking event. It was something softer, real. He didn't reach for his phone. He didn't check his email. Instead, Ethan walked back to the bookstore. The lights were still on, casting a golden glow onto the sidewalk. He didn't know why he went, only that some part of him needed to. And as he stood outside looking in, watching Mira gently reshelve a stack of novels, he felt something shift inside him. He didn't feel like a stranger anymore. He felt like someone at the edge of remembering who he used to be. And maybe, just maybe, that was a beginning worth following. The next morning greeted Ethan with a strange sense of calm, like a silence that had finally been earned. The sound of the creek outside his window whispered through the early light, mingling with the scent of pine drifting in from the trees beyond the inn. For the first time in months, maybe even years, he hadn't woken to a shrill alarm or an urgent call. No meetings, no schedules, no board members expecting a polished version of him. Just light, just breath, just a quiet world that didn't seem to want anything from him. He lingered at the window longer than he meant to, watching as the town slowly came to life. Shopkeepers opened their doors. Steam curled from mugs of coffee clutched by passers-by, and the day unfolded without urgency. He wasn't part of it, not yet, but something inside him longed to be. At breakfast, Maggie mentioned the weekly Friday night gathering at the old barn just past the meadow. It's nothing fancy, she said, pouring him a second cup of coffee. Some music, a bit of food, and good people. You should go. He offered a non-committal nod, unsure if he meant it. But by early evening, when the sun dipped behind the hills and cast the whole town in golden hues, Ethan found himself walking toward the barn with his hands in his pockets and his heart somewhere it hadn't been in a very long time. Open. The barn looked like it had been pulled from a painting. Weathered wood, strung-up lights blinking gently in the growing dusk, and a small crowd gathered around a fire pit nearby. Laughter floated through the air, light and unforced. Children darted around with sparklers, their joy unchecked and contagious. It was the kind of gathering Ethan would have politely declined back in the city, citing work or fatigue or something equally hollow. But tonight, he was here, and he didn't want to leave. He spotted Mira almost immediately. She stood near the barn's entrance, speaking with a woman holding a fiddle case and gesturing animatedly. There was a spark in her eyes, a lightness to the way she moved, and when she turned and caught sight of him, she smiled in a way that felt like sunlight, finally breaking through a dense forest. You came, she said as he approached, handing him a small plate with warm bread and something that smelled like rosemary and lemon. I figured I should experience local culture while I'm stranded, he replied with a playful tone he hadn't used in ages. Stranded, she echoed, grinning. Interesting choice of word. I'd call it an opportunity. He didn't answer right away. The lights reflected in her eyes, and something unspoken passed between them. It wasn't romantic in the way movies portrayed it. There were no dramatic glances or scripted lines. It was quieter, truer. The way a life might begin to change, not in one explosion, but in a series of small, gentle shifts. Inside the barn, the music began. A young man strummed a guitar, while another accompanied him with a mandolin. A few voices joined in, not polished or professional, but heartfelt. Mira guided him to a seat, and together they watched as locals clapped and swayed and sang without hesitation. No one cared who was watching. No one was trying to be impressive. It was a room full of people simply enjoying being together. As the music softened, Mira leaned closer. "This is what saved me, she said, coming back here, letting go of the version of myself I kept trying to be." Ethan looked at her, absorbing the weight behind those words. "Do you ever miss the life you had before this?" "I miss parts of it," she admitted, "but not enough to trade the peace I've found here." He nodded slowly, unsure how to respond, because something about what she said hit him deeper than he was ready for. Peace. The idea of it had felt foreign for so long that he'd stopped believing it was real. But now, in this old barn in a town he couldn't have pointed to on a map a day ago, surrounded by strangers who welcomed him without questions or expectations, he felt it brushing against his edges. It was subtle, but it was there. As the night wore on, more people joined in the dancing. Children laughed, couples swayed, and a few elderly folks clapped along from rocking chairs. Mira stood and extended her hand to Ethan. "Come on," she said. "You look like you could use a little less thinking and a little more doing." He hesitated. His first instinct was to decline, to step back, to remain on the sidelines of a life he didn't yet understand. But then he looked at her, truly looked, and saw not just a woman inviting him to dance, but someone inviting him to live. So he took her hand, and the moment he did, something inside him shifted, not in a loud or dramatic way, but like a long-held breath being released. They moved together, slowly at first, then in rhythm with the music and the room and the laughter that surrounded them. Ethan wasn't thinking about who he was or who he was supposed to be. He wasn't wondering what this moment meant or where it might lead. For once, he was simply there, and maybe, just maybe, that was enough. Ethan woke to the golden hush of a Saturday morning in Woodstock, sunlight slipping past linen curtains and landing across the hardwood floor in long, gentle streaks. The air was still, untouched by urgency. There were no buzzing alerts, no early calls, no reminders flashing across a phone screen. It felt like the world had decided to wait, for once, to move at his pace. He rose slowly, savoring the stretch of silence. There was something sacred about mornings like this, unmeasured and unplanned. After a quick rinse and a coffee downstairs, strong, black, and poured by Maggie with her usual nod of recognition, he wandered out into town, with no destination in mind. The streets were beginning to stir. A few kids rode past on their bikes. A dog barked near the park, and sunlight danced across the windows of small shops opening for the day. Ethan passed the bakery, where the scent of cinnamon rolls curled through the air. Then the florist, where someone was arranging fresh tulips in metal buckets. Life here didn't rush. It simply unfolded. He turned onto a narrow path, shaded by trees, and followed the sound of voices and music until it led him to the village green. A small group of school children were setting up a makeshift stage while parents and townsfolk set out folding chairs and picnic blankets. A chalkboard sign nearby read, Woodstock Youth Festival, Music, Art, and Good Vibes. It was nothing grand, but it was joyful, utterly unmanufactured. Ethan found himself smiling as he watched a girl, no older than 10, read a poem into the microphone with wide eyes and trembling hands. The crowd listened intently, then erupted into applause. There was no cynicism here, no scrutiny, just kindness and participation and pride. He felt a tap on his shoulder. "You came," Mira said, her tone more observation than surprise. "I was curious," he admitted. "Besides, I didn't have a packed schedule today." She laughed. "That's the best kind of schedule." They walked together for a while, Mira greeting people by name, stopping to admire a young boy's painting of the town bridge, complimenting a woman's hand-sewn scarves. It was clear she belonged here, not just geographically, but emotionally. Ethan observed her with quiet fascination. She didn't command attention. She didn't need to. Her presence was felt not because it was loud, but because it was whole. They eventually found a quiet bench, shaded by a willow tree on the far side of the green. The breeze rustled through the leaves, the sound blending with laughter and the occasional strum of a ukulele from a nearby performer. "Last night felt," Ethan began, then paused, searching for the right word. "Different," Mira offered. "Yes, different and honest." She looked at him, her expression open and steady. "That's the thing about this town. It's hard to pretend here. It's like the air doesn't allow it." He nodded, his gaze drifting toward a boy tossing a frisbee with his father. "I spent so long creating a version of myself that I thought people needed. Successful, decisive, always in control. I never stopped to ask if I liked who I'd become." Mira didn't interrupt. She didn't offer cliches or platitudes. She just let the truth sit between them, soft and weightless. "Sometimes I wonder if the life I built was meant for someone else," he continued. "Like I climbed a ladder only to realize it was leaning against the wrong wall." "And now?" she asked gently. "Now I don't know what I want, but I know I want more of whatever this is." Mira's smile was warm, not triumphant. "That's a start." They sat in silence for a while, the kind that doesn't demand filling. A few children ran past, trailing bubbles and laughter behind them. A woman handed them cups of lemonade without asking if they wanted any. Ethan sipped his, tasting tart citrus and sunlight. Everything here was so unassuming, and yet it reached places inside him that nothing else had in years. "I used to think success meant making the world pay attention," Ethan said. "Now I wonder if it's really about finding a place where you can disappear and still feel seen." Mira turned to him. "Maybe it's about being known, not noticed." That distinction hit something deep in him. In the city, he was constantly noticed, but known, truly known? He wasn't sure anyone had ever seen past the curated version of him. As the festival carried on and the music drifted into the afternoon, Ethan began to feel a soft shift inside himself. Not a resolution, not clarity, but a loosening, a lightness. He wasn't here to be convinced of anything, and no one was trying to sell him a dream. But piece by piece, The noise inside him was fading. Later, as the sun dipped toward the hills and the town slowly exhaled into evening, Ethan and Mira walked back toward the center, their steps unhurried, their conversation quiet and unforced. The wrong train had brought him here, but with every step beside her, Ethan was starting to think it had never been wrong at all. Sunday morning came quietly, but the stillness didn't last. Ethan was standing outside the inn, a takeaway coffee in hand, the crisp air brushing his face, when his phone finally caught a signal. The screen lit up with missed calls, unread emails, and message after message marked urgent. His chest tightened as he scrolled, reality rushing back like cold water poured over warm skin. Somewhere in Manhattan, his team was unraveling. A deal he had spent months securing was starting to slip. Investors were growing restless, and his absence, until now a silent rebellion, was becoming a liability. He should have expected this. He'd built a world that couldn't function without him. Or maybe he had built a version of himself that didn't know how to function outside of that world. A call came through. He answered out of reflex. Ethan, thank God. It was Rachel, his VP of operations. Her voice was sharp with concern, but there was something beneath it too. Disappointment. We're losing traction. Mark is pulling back from the deal. The legal team is blind without your sign-off, and the board's demanding answers. He closed his eyes. I'll be back tonight. There was a pause, just long enough for the weight of those words to settle. We need you here, she said. And then, more softly, wherever you've been, I hope it was worth it. The line went dead. Ethan stood there, phone in hand, caught between the place he had come from and the one he wasn't sure he could leave behind. He could already feel the suit wrapping around him again, the headlines returning to claim him, the echo of his name in sterile boardrooms. The world he had mastered waited just beyond the tracks, but it no longer felt like home. Later that afternoon, he found Mira in the bookshop, seated cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by a pile of new donations. Her hair was pulled back in a loose braid, a pencil tucked behind one ear. She looked up when he entered and offered him a smile, gentle, unassuming, the kind of smile that didn't expect anything in return. He hesitated, then sat beside her. I got the call, he said. They need me back. Her hands stilled over a book. And what do you want? He shook his head, a bitter smile forming. That's the problem. I don't know. I've spent so long doing what was expected. I don't even know what I want anymore. But I do know that walking away from everything I built, it feels reckless. Maybe, Mira said softly, or maybe it's just honest. He looked at her, eyes searching. Do you think it's possible to want two different lives at once? I think it's possible to want peace after you've only known pressure, she replied. And I think it's brave to admit that you're not sure which path is yours anymore. They sat in silence for a while, the kind that didn't feel empty. Ethan's eyes moved around the shop, rows of books lovingly shelved, handwritten notes sticking out from between pages, a life built not on scale, but on sincerity. This place changes people, he said quietly. Or maybe it just reveals who they've been trying to be all along. Mira didn't answer right away. When she did, her voice was steady. Whatever choice you make it because it feels true. Not because it looks right. Not because someone expects it. You owe yourself that. That night, Ethan packed his bag. Not because he wanted to, because he had to. Or at least, that's what he told himself. His train would leave in the morning, and by evening, he'd be sitting back at the long glass table overlooking Manhattan, fielding questions, restoring calm, pretending none of this had happened. But it had happened, and as he stood on the front porch of the inn one last time, looking out over the quiet street, bathed in moonlight, he realized that no matter what he returned to, he wouldn't be the same. The noise wouldn't sound the same. The demands wouldn't carry the same weight. Mira had said something to him earlier that he couldn't forget. Do what you won't regret later. He didn't know what that meant yet. He wasn't ready to rewrite his entire life in a single night. But he was starting to believe that maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to go back to the man he was before the wrong train. He just had to figure out who he wanted to become instead. New York hadn't changed. The city was still a mosaic of ambition and urgency. Every block humming with intention. But Ethan had changed, and the difference struck him the moment he stepped back into the glass and steel cocoon of his office tower. The elevator ride to the top floor felt longer than usual, more hollow. He could see his reflection in the mirrored walls. Sharp suit, crisp lines, perfect posture. But the man staring back at him no longer felt entirely real. The boardroom was waiting. Rachel was already seated, her expression composed but tired. A few of the partners nodded curtly as he entered. On the table lay the proposal he had once treated like scripture. The expansion plan, the acquisition deal, the carefully forecasted growth projections that promised to launch the company into a new echelon. Let's begin, someone said. But for the first time in a long time, Ethan hesitated. He sat, opened the folder in front of him, and stared at the numbers. He should have felt excited, or at least focused. Instead, he felt removed, as though he was watching himself from outside his own body. The further they discussed the plan, the more Ethan felt the gnawing sensation that he was participating in someone else's future, not his own. Rachel caught his eye at one point, brows raised slightly, as if asking, "Are you still in this?" That night, back in his penthouse, he stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over the city he had once dreamed of conquering. The skyline blinked back at him, a monument to progress and power. But he couldn't stop thinking about a small town hundreds of miles away, where no one knew his name, where the air smelled like pine and the days had space for silence. He couldn't stop seeing Mira's face, steady, kind, unhurried. In the days that followed, he went through the motions, meetings, presentations, conference calls. But his heart wasn't in it. The deal closed. Headlines praised his leadership. Investors celebrated. And still, a quiet ache settled beneath the noise. He began leaving the office earlier than usual. He stopped answering calls after dinner. He walked instead of taking cars. And late at night, he sat with a blank notebook, trying to write something, anything, that might help him make sense of the growing divide between the life he lived and the life that suddenly felt possible. A week after his return, he stood again at the boardroom table. This time, he wasn't holding a pitch or a proposal. He was holding his resignation letter. The room went still. "You can't be serious," one executive said. "You're walking away from everything," another added. Ethan looked around the room at faces that had been beside him for years. Some were stunned, others angry. A few simply nodded, like they'd sensed this coming all along. "I'm not walking away from everything," he said. "I'm walking towards something else, something quieter, something that feels more like me." He left the office that day without a plan, without a title, without a future mapped out in 5-year projections. And for the first time in his adult life, he felt light. He spent the next week off the grid. No meetings, no headlines, no decisions to make. He wandered through Central Park. He visited the art museum he hadn't stepped foot in for a decade. He sat at cafes and watched people, just to remember what it looked like when life was happening without a deadline. But Woodstock pulled at him quietly, insistently. He thought of Mira often, her bookstore, the creek outside his window, the music in the barn, the taste of that warm cider, the space between their conversations, and most of all, the way being there had made him feel not like a success, but like a person. So he packed a bag, not much, just enough for a few days, and got on the train. This time, the right one. But not because it followed the planned route, because it took him where he actually wanted to go. When he arrived in town, the sun was beginning to dip low, casting the familiar streets in amber light. Everything looked the same, but everything felt different. He walked the same cobbled path he had days earlier as a stranger, but this time, each storefront felt like it had been waiting for him to return. He found Mira in the bookstore, reorganizing a shelf near the back. She turned as he entered, her expression unreadable for a moment. Then she smiled, soft and knowing. "I wasn't sure you'd come back," she said. "I wasn't either," he admitted. "But I realized I didn't want to build a life I had to escape from. I want to build one I can stay in." She didn't say anything right away, just nodded and reached for another book. "Do you want to help me shelve these?" she asked. He took the book from her hand and slid it into place. It was simple. It was ordinary. And it was the most right anything had felt in a very long time. The days in Woodstock unfolded differently now. Ethan no longer woke to the familiar buzz of urgent emails or the sterile glow of city skyscrapers. He woke instead to the rustle of trees outside the inn, the scent of brewing coffee drifting up from Maggie's kitchen, and the quiet hum of a town that never demanded more than presence. He had extended his stay once, then again, until it became clear there was no real deadline anymore. He wasn't here on borrowed time. He was here because he chose to be. Word had spread quickly, though no one seemed especially impressed by his previous titles or accomplishments. That was the beauty of this place. Nobody cared who you used to be, only who you were willing to become. When Mira asked him one morning if he'd consider helping with a technology project for the local library, he said yes without thinking, not because it furthered some professional goal, but because the idea of using his skills for something tangible, something that served the people he now lived among, felt like the kind of success he'd never known how to measure before. He began volunteering a few days a week, helping the librarian digitize their catalog, training teenagers on basic coding, setting up a simple website for book reservations. The space became familiar, and the people, once faces in passing, became names and voices and stories he came to care about. He wasn't Ethan Cole, CEO, anymore. He was just Ethan, the guy who fixed the library's Wi-Fi, who helped Mrs. Connolly retrieve her email password for the 3rd time, who taught high school students how to build their first app. And somehow, that was enough. His relationship with Mira deepened, not with sweeping declarations, but through the quiet consistency of shared mornings, evening walks, and long conversations by the fire. She had a way of making even the simplest moments feel profound. A glance over coffee, the way she ran her fingers across book spines when searching for something, the thoughtful pauses she took before answering even the most casual question. With her, Ethan didn't feel like he was being pulled into someone else's world. He felt like he was finally stepping into his own. They spent weekends exploring nearby trails, stopping at roadside stands for fresh peaches and jars of honey, sometimes saying nothing for miles at a time. He discovered how much could be communicated in silence, how connection didn't always need words. In the city, silence had meant discomfort, a pause that needed to be filled. Here, it was space, soft, expansive, generous. One Saturday afternoon, after helping a group of kids finish building a basic website for their school's poetry club, Ethan sat on the library steps, watching the town move around him. The light filtered through the trees like golden dust, and for a brief moment, he felt as if the world had slowed down just for him. Not to reward him, not to tempt him, but to invite him. Mira arrived a few minutes later, holding 2 lemonades and a bag of warm cookies from the bakery. "I heard your coding class was a hit," she said, passing him the drink. "They asked if I'd help with a podcast next. I think I'm being recruited." "They like you," she said, settling beside him. "You don't just teach. You make them feel capable." He looked at her, touched by the sincerity in her voice. "That's funny," he said. "They're the ones making me feel that way." They sat there for a while, watching life pass without rush. It occurred to Ethan that he no longer measured his days in completed tasks or revenue charts. His calendar wasn't full, but his life was. "I used to think I had to build something massive to matter," he said quietly. "Something that proved I was worth the space I took up in the world." "And now?" she asked. "Now, I think it's about what you give to the space you're in, and who you share it with." Mira reached over and took his hand. "That sounds like something you didn't learn in any boardroom." He laughed, a sound unburdened and real. "No, that was all you." She shook her head gently. "It was already in you. You just needed the silence to hear it." As the sun dipped lower, casting their shadows long across the steps, Ethan felt a sense of belonging he hadn't known he was missing. There was no headline to chase, no applause to earn, just a small town, a woman who saw him clearly, and a version of himself he was only beginning to recognize. He didn't know what the future looked like, and for the first time in his life, that thought didn't terrify him. Because whatever came next, he knew it would be built on something real. Not a name, not a title, not a valuation. Just this, just here. The seasons in Woodstock changed more slowly than they did in the city. There was a rhythm to everything here, a kind of patient unfolding. By the time autumn arrived, the leaves had begun to turn gold and crimson, and the air held a quiet crispness that whispered of wood smoke and harvest. Ethan had never paid attention to seasons before. They came and went, marked only by quarterly earnings and market shifts. But now, each change felt personal, almost like the earth was speaking a language he'd only recently begun to understand. He had stayed, not as a visitor, not as a man in transition, but as someone who had made a choice. The penthouse in New York had been sold. The company had moved on without him. And remarkably, the world hadn't ended. In fact, it had opened. The pace of his life no longer mimicked the pulse of a stock ticker. It mirrored the sunrise, the hush of the creek at night, the laughter echoing from the schoolyard where he now occasionally helped with after-school projects. Mira had become more than a gentle presence in his days. She had become a quiet certainty. Their lives had woven together, not with fireworks, but with the steady thread of shared mornings, long walks, and an intimacy built on presence rather than performance. They didn't need to talk about the future in grand terms. The future, they agreed, was made in the small things: how they listened, how they showed up, how they stayed. One evening, after helping set up for the town's autumn festival, Ethan found himself standing at the edge of the same park bench where he had once sat alone, lost and frustrated, trying to make sense of a train that had taken him to the wrong place. But now, the scene was entirely different. The bench faced the pond, still as glass beneath the fading light. Children darted between booths, strung with lights and homemade crafts. Music drifted from a nearby stage, a soft acoustic melody played by one of the teenagers he'd mentored. He sat down slowly, the cool wood beneath him grounding and familiar. Mira soon joined him, carrying 2 mugs of cider. She passed one to him, and for a while they simply watched the festival bloom around them. "This place has changed," he said. She glanced at him with a small smile. "Or maybe you have," he nodded. "I used to think happiness had to be earned, like it was some reward waiting at the end of a long road of sacrifice. But now I think it's something you create, something you let yourself notice." Mira leaned into him, her head resting lightly on his shoulder. "Sometimes it takes losing your map to realize you were never on the right path." They sat there in the soft hush of twilight, wrapped in the quiet understanding that they had both chosen lives that no longer needed validation from the outside world. Theirs was not a love born of grand gestures or whirlwind confessions. It had unfolded slowly, like the town around them, rooted in trust and shared silences, in the gentle offering of themselves without masks. As the stars began to prick the sky above them, Ethan thought of the man he used to be, the one who measured his worth in productivity and acquisitions, who never slowed down long enough to feel the ground beneath his feet. That version of him had been successful, yes, but so deeply alone. And he realized that the true journey hadn't begun with a business pitch or a bold decision. It had begun with a mistake, a missed train, a wrong turn, a quiet town that didn't care who he was before he arrived, and Mira, the woman who hadn't tried to change him, but had simply made space for him to become. As the music played and lanterns swayed gently above the crowd, Ethan felt a calm settle over him. Not the kind that comes from solving a problem or reaching a goal, but the kind that comes from knowing you're exactly where you're meant to be, with the person you're meant to be there with. He turned to Mira. "Thank you." "For what?" she asked, her voice soft. "For seeing me before I knew who I was. For letting me be someone new without needing an explanation." She took his hand, her fingers curling gently into his. "We all get lost sometimes," she said. "But some places, some people, they're meant to help you find your way back." As the festival flickered around them and the night deepened, Ethan Cole, once a name printed on the front of Forbes, once a man chained to the ticking hands of a clock, sat quietly beside the woman he loved, in a town that had asked nothing of him but to be present. And for the first time in his life, he wasn't chasing anything. He was home. Ethan Cole's story began with everything the world told him to chase: power, prestige, and wealth. As the CEO of a thriving tech company, he was the very image of success. a man who had built an empire from nothing, with a view from the top and the influence to shape entire industries. But beneath the polished exterior was a man suffocating under the weight of constant expectations, disconnected from meaning, and profoundly alone. It took a single, unintended detour, a wrong train, to unravel everything he thought defined him. That mistake led him to Woodstock, a small, quiet town that asked for nothing and yet offered everything he never knew he needed. There, in the simplicity of cobblestone streets, handwritten signs, and the stillness of a world unmeasured by productivity, Ethan began to see himself differently. He met Mira, a woman rooted not in ambition, but in presence. Through her, and through the gentle pace of the town itself, he learned how to be still, how to listen, and how to reconnect with the parts of himself long buried beneath boardroom strategies and business plans. Ethan's journey wasn't dramatic or fast-paced. It was a quiet unfolding, a slow stripping away of what was no longer serving him. He didn't find fulfillment in a promotion or a sudden revelation. He found it in watching children read poetry in a park, in helping a librarian troubleshoot her email, in sitting beside someone who expected nothing but his honesty. When he finally chose to leave his company, it wasn't a loss. It was a return. He let go of the life that demanded his perfection and stepped into one that welcomed his truth. The most powerful lesson in Ethan's story is this: success without connection is just noise. We live in a world that glorifies productivity, status, and constant motion, but often at the cost of our inner peace and emotional clarity. Ethan reminds us that it's okay to stop. It's okay to question everything you've built if it no longer feels like it's yours. Sometimes, the wrong train takes us exactly where we're meant to be, not because we were lost, but because we needed to be found in a different way. So, how do we apply this to our lives? We can start by slowing down, by questioning which parts of our identity are genuinely ours and which were inherited through expectations. We can make time for presence, for silence, for the people who see us not for our accomplishments, but for our essence. And we can give ourselves permission to pivot, not out of failure, but out of growth. If Ethan's story touched you, if it made you reflect on your own path, or reminded you of what truly matters, we invite you to support our channel. Subscribe, like, and turn on notifications so we can continue sharing stories that speak to the heart, that slow the world down for a moment, and that remind us all of the quiet power of choosing love, authenticity, and purpose over noise. Your support means the world. And remember, sometimes the best journeys begin with getting just a little bit lost.